So I believe we're off to a good start of this event with some sort of scene-setting basic discussions. One thing we haven't really touched, or it's been mentioned a few times, is of course who is going to pay for all of this. We know that we were going to need a lot of finance within the industry, but also in all these supporting, let's say, infrastructure and with raw materials, energy, and so on around. And so the next session, and I must say that this is a first for World Steel. Financing is not normally a topic that we're very familiar with, but we would like to bring it into this event because it's definitely a key for the transition. So. Let me introduce, if I can go to the slide. All right, okay, let me tell everyone first that we can, of course, continue this discussion online. We have a hashtag for this event that is Open Forum 2023. And apparently you can find all our social media channels in the event app. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, please do so. All right, so we're moving into the next session on financing the transition. Let me introduce my colleague, Soo-Young Kim. She is head of our sustainability communications at World Steel. In that role, she's leading the discussion on the sustainability material issues and the stakeholder communication. So, Sue, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch to go through this somehow unfamiliar but very important topic for our transition. This session, Financing the Transition, was to be chaired by Andrew Purvis, the Director of Sustainable Manufacturing at World Steel until yesterday. Unfortunately, he has fallen ill and can't be with us in the room today, but I think he's joining us online. So I am filling in his shoes today and I hope to make a good session with you all. Before I start the session, let me ask our panelists to come up to the stage and then sit in the chair. Dr. Kwasi Ampofo, Gabrielle de Laval, and Alfredo is joining us online, and Elizabeth, can you please come up? Welcome you all to Antwerp and to the world of steel. We have 4 panels from different sectors of finance world who I believe would provide very interesting views on financing the transition for our industry today. Let me open the session with the information we have gathered on the estimated cost for the transition, as well as steelmakers' views on the transition, financing the transition. Transition to net zero has been the top topic for many years, for many of us in the recent years. Low carbon pathway, targets and goals, low carbon products, breakthrough technologies, terminologies, methodologies, policies, regulations, we all have been talking about this. This transition topic has instigated many discussions on various topics, but what we have not actually touched base on is how we're going to finance the transition. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk about this today with all of you and then this special panelist from finance world. As mentioned earlier, we know where we need to be for the transition, and the discussion has moved on to how we get there. One of the critical enabling aspects for the transition is fund for the transition. What is the expected cost of the transition for the steel industry? What is the time distribution of the expenditure on investment? How much of this cost will would be directly spent in the steel industry. More questions. Who will pay the largest share, and how would this be financed? Is there enough money in the world? Earlier this year, we started looking into several reports published by various institutions and organizations, all talked about required investment for the steel transition. And we gathered all this information and analyzed and then came up with some numbers to share with you today. You see the numbers? This is the amount, what we would call reasonably estimated range of transition cost for the cross-value chain of the steel industry. The range has been drawn from our analysis of various papers I mentioned. So, between $3,500 billion to $5,500 billion. I don't know whether the scale actually registered to your mind. Okay, I will come back to this figure during our panel discussion that will be followed shortly. So these are showing the key elements of the transition that commonly talked about by the papers, studies, with a varied weight on each element. These key elements would play different roles and require different financing depending on the strategy of steelmakers and also enabling environment where they operate. We look at the cost by element now. Maybe you have already guessed that energy requires the biggest cost. CapEx to sustain existing facilities and equipment requires 3 times more than the CapEx for new facilities and equipment. Well, a lot of interesting findings, but I would not go into so much details, but we are talking about a big amount. And another question, where would this money come from? I hope that by having this conversation with the people from finance and from all sectors of value chain of the steel industry, we somehow find a way to have a clear idea of how we finance our transition. And learning all this information from our analysis also led us to collect perspectives of steel producers on the investment and their financing plan. So we carried out a survey with the World Steel members on this topic for the very first time. So I'm sharing a few key findings from the survey. Well, in the short term, higher portion of investment is planned to go to efficiency and energy savings, while 3 more areas are planned for even portion of investment in the longer term between 2030 and 2050. I think this is aligned with we saw the pathway from various reports. The first step is to invest in the current equipment and facilities to improve the efficiency and the energy savings, then move on to the breakthrough technologies and the new technologies. Also, our members said they consider commercial banks and government loans as main source of main source of funding for their transition. While they consider government support is an absolute element for the transition, they also think a climate finance option will be very helpful for their transition. Larger companies consider technical risk as the greatest barrier for their transition, but smaller companies had a slightly different view on that. They see inadequate return as the greatest barrier to finance their green project. You mentioned earlier that it has to be somehow guaranteed that companies can invest in the new technologies. Both larger and smaller makers think climate change and sustainability transition will remain a significant factor in their business, in their operation, in the longer term. It is not going to go away anytime soon. So that's the perspective from our members. And what we have observed from our members' response is a third of responding companies. I'm not saying that every World Steel member has responded to the survey, but we have collected enough sample to make a kind of a general opinion of the steel industry. A third of responding companies do not have Paris-aligned pathways. That's a bit alarming, but not a surprise. More than 50% already have their aligned transition plan. About 13% have their plans underway. This gives us a task to get the 1/3 on board to our transition. Our work needs to start with them. As briefly mentioned in the previous slide, we see noticeable difference in the needs and views and approaches between smaller and larger steel makers. We were also glad to see that many World Steel members are quite familiar with and also have good level of understanding on the green finance options and the pros and cons of using them, which is quite good news for us. We also find it interesting that members show quite high level of trust in sustainability and climate financing and its associated labels. I hope this information gives you some ideas on the scale of the investment required for the steel transition, but also what steelmakers think of their financing for the transition. And I hope that we have a bit clearer idea how we fund our transition at the end of the session with the conversation with the finance people. I will stop here and move on to other interesting information and insight. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Kwasi Ampofo to share his analysis and insight on this very interesting topic and important topic. Oops, sorry. I didn't move on to, okay.
Good day, everyone. So probably for those of you who saw me in that corner of the corridor, Sue re-emphasized the point that I've got 20 minutes. And so that's exactly, and I did promise I'll do 20 minutes, so it's precisely 20 minutes. Wherever I am, I would expect you to give me a round of applause and I'll take my seat. So today I'm really going to talk about steel decarbonization. And my job here was really to paint the picture of what is at stake, because sometimes financing can be very optimistic, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, but then what problem is that financing going to address? So I wanted to sort of open today with the scale of the challenge ahead. So what is the current state of the industry, of the whole decarbonization cluster? So the way we like to look at it is that we currently take all the capacity covered by corporate net zero target, and we look at the scale of that industry. And back when we started tracking this data in 2021, it would interest you to know that actually steel was #1 on our list in terms of the industry that had a lot of net zero commitments in terms of companies willing to reach net zero by 2050. But what changed over the last 2 years? Obviously, aluminum has taken that place, plastic has overtaken steel, and it comes down to the fact that the last few years we've seen enormous capacity addition in Asia, particularly in China, that are yet to make these commitments to net zero. And we do believe that over time, they would also join the wagon of making those commitments to reach net zero. This is a very optimistic chart. So every year we publish what we call the New Energy Outlook, which looks at how we think the energy industry will evolve under two broad scenarios. So obviously the economic transition scenario, which looks at the economics of today and the least cost, and then the net zero target, which looks at what if we could attain net zero. And we do believe that there's still runway for hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, petrochemicals to reach net zero, but then those decisions that need to enable the steel industry to reach net zero by 2050 must start now. And really putting that previous chart into context, what we see is that once again, this is least cost. This is not based on the strategies your companies in the room are making. So we believe that if subsidy, if the financing, if everything goes on right, the technology rollout goes on right, this could potentially be the picture for steel manufacturing by 2050. Obviously, scrap would take a big chunk of it. The all-champion hydrogen would have helped us reach net zero for 42% of capacity. And then we're going to have CCS complement another 16%, all the way down to new technologies like electrolysis. So in summarizing that chart, this is how I like to call the next 3 decades. So if you ask me what will be the one sentence I would describe the 2020s with, I think the 2020s is the decade where we're going to really perfect our recycling, increase our rate, and switch to clean energy. Now, how would I describe the 2030s for the steel industry? I would say that this is a time where majority of the technologies that your companies were banking on would have reached maturity, like hydrogen, and then we'll start building new direct reduction plants. And then what would the 2040s look like? That is where we'll probably be approaching sunset on our ambitious targets. And there I feel that the blue sky technologies like electrolysis would have taken play, and almost every new plant would have adopted these technologies. And once again, like I said, this is ambitious, but sometimes you need a little bit of ambition in the room. So now I wanted to center on two important technologies that would enable us to address these challenges, and that is recycling and hydrogen. Why? Because in the previous chart that I showed, those were the two technologies that actually helped contribute to us reaching net zero, if we can ever have a shot at it. Net zero steel cost is still very high, and it's unsurprising that a lot of you in this room would probably not consider it in your immediate plans. If you look at the chart I'm currently showing, the gray part looks at the business as usual cost for producing steel. And what we're looking at is that currently, if you wanted to produce net zero steel, your natural gas plus offsets could provide a pathway in terms of it remaining in the business as usual. Recycling steel, depending on where you are, could also help you reach net zero. But then once you start looking at technologies like hydrogen, CCS, and electrolysis, you're clearly out of scope in terms of your cost. And those are things that you rather consider in future or up until cost has really come down. But there's something interesting that I wanted to highlight as well. The dotted colors you see there are the various countries or the average of countries. And you can see that China remains competitive in natural gas offsets and others like hydrogen. But then once you go into CCS, it actually becomes one of the highest costs, simply because there's currently no CCS infrastructure, and the transport cost compared to doing that in the US is actually very high. And as such, that is the reason why we see China becoming very, very expensive in terms of using the CCS pathway. And later I'll talk about how this has defined China's approach or Chinese companies' approach to net zero steel. But look, this is 2021. Let me take you into the future. It looks like 2050. A lot of things need to happen for us to reach there. But then if we do get all those aligned, we do think that by 2050, with the exception of CCS, most of these, what we classify as blue sky and other new technologies, would be within the range of the business as usual costs. And we would have achieved net zero, but then we would probably not break the budget in doing so. So in terms of our net zero options, I wanted to highlight the recycling part as well. So we've sort of created what we call the various technology alternatives, and then try to cost them on the levelized cost of steel production. And that is the only way, of course, we can compare apples to apples. And you can see that scrap EAF plus clean power certainly sits in the middle somewhere. And I wanted to throw a little bit of spotlight on that. If you're looking at this chart, what we think is going to be the biggest driver of scrap EAF plus clean power, it's obviously the price of scrap and the price of clean power. And this is a bit of it's a hard chart, but let me unpack it for you, right? So let's take a look at the left one as an example. The x-axis is showing you the price of scrap on a per ton basis, per dollar per ton basis. And then the y-axis is showing you the cost of producing your steel. So what we're saying is that, for example, let's take $400. If scrap prices reach $400, if you draw a line to catch the y-axis on the line you see there, what you're seeing is that at $400 scrap price, per ton scrap price, the cost of producing your steel goes up to about $600. At $500, it goes to about $700. So the key thing we are trying to say here is that, yes, we're very bullish about scrap EAF, but then a big chunk of that would depend on the prices of scrap. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you're looking at the cost of renewable power. And once again, for example, if your renewable power is $40 per megawatt hour, you're looking at a cost of about about 400 for cash cost. But then once it goes into about 100, you're looking at about 500. So clearly, if we can make scrap EAF plus clean power a competitive option for the market, it's important that scrap prices remain stable. And then also the cost of renewable energy significantly comes down. But then let's look at scrap prices. For those who are thinking that scrap prices or scrap would let you escape the volatility of the commodity price market, the simple answer is no. It also has its own super cycle wave. And you can see that for HRC, steel in the US, it has its up and down, and it's also driven by its own market forces. So the key thing to note here is that is not as stable as for those who were hoping they could escape the price volatility of steel or iron ore or other raw materials. Now let's flip to hydrogen. Hydrogen sits a little bit up the curve from recycling, but then what would it take for us to make hydrogen competitive? Once again, so similar to the chart that I show, the biggest contributor to make hydrogen steel a cost-competitive alternative will be the price of hydrogen. So let's look at the x-axis, which shows the price or the cost of producing hydrogen. Currently, we are sitting about between $5 to $6 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And once again, if you extrapolate that onto the y-axis, what that means is that at this current cost of producing hydrogen, you're looking at close to about between $700 and $800 cost for producing your steel. That is unsustainable and is way out of the scope for business as usual. But then, hey, this is where a little bit of bullishness does not kill. We do think that based on what we see in the market between now and 2050, the cost of producing hydrogen could go down between $1 and $2 per kilogram. And we do think that once that happens, obviously the cost of producing clean steel with hydrogen will come into scope in terms of business as usual. But then again, there's something that there is no consensus in the industry. How much hydrogen do we need to produce steel? And I can open that up, 30 seconds. How much hydrogen can produce a ton of steel? Anyone?
Here. 50.
50. Any other? 80? 70? And you're not wrong. That's precisely what's happening in the industry. Our good old professors in the universities are telling us 50 to 65. Bow is telling us they will do it between 75 to 80. POSCO is telling us they need 100. And if what just happened in this room is a snapshot of what is happening in the industry, there's currently no consensus. And the reason why I make this is that, yes, we're quite bullish on pricing, but it's important to realize that there's still no consensus on a lot of things when it comes to hydrogen. Blue-green hydrogen, I was trying hard not to use colors. I think they're irrelevant. But then the key point is that renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen is still a little bit further off when you talk about producing it at competitive prices to make green steel a reality. But then again, today in some countries, if you're looking at hydrogen produced from natural gas with CCS, and even those produced without CCS, there are some countries like Brazil where they remain quite competitive. The picture will change by 2050. A few other countries would be able to produce green hydrogen at cost-competitive prices. And in the long run, pretty much almost every country. And once again, there are a lot of things that need to happen for this to happen, for this to become a reality. But then by 2050, a lot of other countries should be able to produce green hydrogen at cost-competitive prices as well. So I've talked about the big picture. I hope I've brought some optimism in the room. But what are companies like you doing? So pretty much in terms of net zero targets, there's no consensus, similar to the amount of hydrogen that will be needed to produce steel. There are companies like those in Korea that are really hoping recycling and hydrogen will take off. If you take a company like Kabao, there's no specific focus. They are really spreading their seeds to see which of them stick in terms of helping them to reach net zero. And if you take companies like SSAB, they've really picked their battles and then they want to focus on it. And these are data that we do track. Most steel makers are aiming for net zero by 2050, but there are two exceptions. Let me see in the room if there is anyone from SSAB or ThyssenKrupp. Anyone? Oh, great. You are really bold, and they are the only exception in terms of corporates that we track that have made targets to 2050. Obviously, SSAB said they will reach it by 2030, and ThyssenKrupp wants to reach it by 2045, and the rest will go by 2050. And in terms of the project announced, so low project announced, ArcelorMittal leads that league, and these are not based on capacity. This is based on numbers, so project 1, project 2, project 3. So you can see that ArcelorMittal, across the various different technologies, have made almost 20, are working on almost 20 different projects. SSAB is working on about 5 of them, and other companies as well. And customers would also make a big push. In the earlier or in the previous panel, there was conversation as to what role customers would play. So first, let's start with a big stick policy from the government where I'm going to reach net zero by 2060 or 2050. Then carbon price kicks in. Not everybody goes through that route. Europe will do that. America will probably not at the federal level. Then this third phase is investors start demanding. Your shareholders, your board start demanding that, look, we need to address this whole ESG elephant in the room now. What is your strategy as a company? Then the market demand kicks in, right? So you see Apple, you see Ford, you see GM start saying that, look, what is your emissions profile? Can you not rather give me green steel instead? And then finally, industry will now compete to upgrade their technology because there's demand, there's cost competitiveness, and then there's consumers that are willing to buy it. So customers are already signing contracts. That's also very interesting because usually when people talk about green steel, the assumption is that who is going to buy it? Well, we've tracked 48 supply agreements for green steel in your industry today. And I know 48 is not a large number. Unfortunately, we don't have the number on the percentage of global production that this represents. But I do think that is a good start, and it's important to put that in context, that from 0 a few years ago to 48 different supply chain agreements, that is progress. And I was hoping that would get a round of applause for your industry. I still have a few minutes, so please hold on to that applause. So early green steel projects still rely on a lot of government funding, and I think funding will be the topic of discussion for my panel, and we'll probably talk about that more. But then ranging from about 5% of the cost of the project to about 40% of the cost of the project, what we're increasingly seeing is that governments are playing a key role in ensuring that companies are able to de-risk the cost of these technologies in order for them to green their production. A helping hand from policymakers will certainly play a key role, as we've seen in the previous slide. So what are government doing? And this is where I'll probably finish off. Number one, incentives will be needed for net zero. It shouldn't just be the responsibility of the companies in this room. Because if you look at the carbon price, that would have to kick in to incentivize the development of some of these technologies. It's just not sustainable to rely on companies alone to develop these technologies and ensure that the production of steel is green. But the good news is that carbon pricing programs are all over the world, whether you're looking at California, whether you're looking at Kazakhstan, whether you're looking at Chile, whether you're looking at wherever. The world is not short. There's no shortage of some form of carbon pricing mechanisms. But that's the good news. What is the bad news? Not many of them can help us reach our Paris goal targets. So it's important that it's not just a stick. There are other things that government needs to put in place to ensure that these become a reality beyond just the carbon pricing. EU carbon price is set to rise, but the industry still gets a pass. And I'm pretty sure for those of us who produce in Europe, we are familiar with the allowances that most of the companies get in order to ensure that European steel manufacturing companies are still cost competitive. And what that means is that because of these allowances, the true cost of carbon or the true price of carbon that is needed to incentivize these companies or these technologies to truly reach net zero or to truly contribute to net zero or reach cost competitive cost would be about 18,000 for example, the arc furnace, DR electric arc furnace, 18,000 with the allowances companies are receiving today. That is a price of carbon where we do believe that they have to be, or that's where prices need to be in order to really trigger a true change that would help us meet the Paris Agreement. So what that means is that a system which gives price or a trading scheme that obviously provides a stick to prevent companies from investing in polluting technologies and at the same time provide allowances would really not achieve what governments intend to do. Switching on to China, you can see that obviously China's emissions may have already peaked, and we do estimate that the steel sector for China might have reached its peak emission by 2020. And as such, initiatives like the capacity swapping is making the electric arc furnace development more attractive in China, and that's one of the data we track as well. And also, talking about the All Super Inflation Reduction Act, yes, it does move the needle, but does it move the needle significantly for most of the steel producers banking on hydrogen in the United States? Probably not so much. And I think with that, I wanted to add my disclaimer that this is not investment advice. And thank you so much for your audience, and I look forward to an engaging discussion on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwashi, for the interesting presentation with full of useful information. I'm sure that you find the information and all the data in the presentation so useful, and I think a lot of you would like to have that presentation to go home with. Before we receive questions from the floor, let me ask the panelists to talk about their interest in the steel transition and their level of optimism regarding the financing of the steel industry transition. Shall we begin with Gabriel? Gabriel is from Crédit Agricole.
Thank you. So very quickly, Crédit Agricole is a commercial bank, so I will try with humility to represent the commercial bank world on this very exciting topic. So, of course, when it comes to financing the transition, hopefully we will find some banks. Otherwise, as mentioned in the intro slide, you will only rely on government, if I understand correctly. So our goal as a bank is really to support you. We don't want the financing world to stand in the critical path of decarbonation. It's not only about steel. I was looking, the global balance sheet of our bank is 3 times the GDP of Belgium. So actually we're trapped into transition. So we have no choice but to help you to decarbonize. Otherwise, we collectively will have a massive problem 2035, 2040, 2025, 45. So as a global bank, as I mentioned, steel is already part of what we're doing, and it has to be part of what we will be doing in 2035. So again, transition for us is a matter of survival, just because we want our clients to be alive. So our interest in steel, then, to be on the positive side of things, for us it's also a massive opportunity. As a bank, you know, when we see the numbers, 5,000 billions needed to be invested, of course the financing was saying, okay, how can I address that? For us, it's a market, I would say. So it is both a big challenge because we need, again, to help you, and it's not an easy pathway. But for us, it's also a massive opportunity. So that's why I could say, as a starting point for us as a commercial bank.
Thank you, Gabriel. That's the warming up question. We will come back to you with the more specific questions later on. What about you, Alfredo? You are with us online. Do you hear me okay? Alfredo is from Asia Development Bank.
Can you guys hear me well then?
Yeah. Can you also tell us what you think of what's your interest in the steel transition and your level of optimism regarding our transition?
Well, I represent ADB, which is a multilateral development bank, which operates very similar to the World Bank, EBRD, Inter-American, and all these. Essentially, our development programs shied away from heavy industries in the past 2 decades because of changes of priorities. But now we are coming back to steel, we're coming back to cement, to fertilizers as well, heavy industries, essentially because of their impact on climate change. And now all our MDBs are becoming more focused on climate, and we are turning our side to those heavy emitters and hard-to-abate industries. And that's why MDBs, as well as, in my case, ADB, we're starting to work with some governments towards redirecting or kind of supporting their industries to decarbonize. Not only energy, even though that's our main core business, related to transformation of power generation, energy efficiency, electricity, and grid operation and all that, but also how the hard-to-abate industries, like in this case steel, can decarbonize. And in that sense, we are trying to support through some technical assistance, some financing to governments, to SOEs, to state-owned enterprises, and our private sector arm also supports private companies to do that through commercial loans, but with some technical assistance as well as some enabling environment support towards having the right regulation, the right policies in place to benefit both from the overall country's direction, but as well to access, for example, carbon markets and climate finance. And maybe we can discuss more in detail later how are we doing this in ADB developing member countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. I thought we have a few slides to share with the audience, but it didn't run. But we can share it.
That's fine. It was just a summary of things, so no issue.
Okay, but we will make the presentation made available to our audience after the open forum. And now we go to Elizabeth from Climate Investment Fund. Can you tell us about the same?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Elizabeth Sykes-McCarthy. I'm here from the Climate Investment Funds. And in case anybody isn't yet familiar with the Climate Investment Funds, we were founded in 2008 as a fast-moving multilateral response to address the climate challenge. We now stand at $11 billion as the largest pool of concessional climate finance, serving 6 of the AAA-rated MDBs. And today, we have a 15-year track record for innovative, clean technology in developing countries, delivering scalable, reliable, and proven demonstration effects for those innovation technologies. Which brings us to today, the Industry Decarbonization Program, launched last year at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We're currently capitalized at $80 million with a fundraising goal of $500 million and anticipated co-financing of $2 to $3 billion. Now, our commitment is not just to industry decarbonization, but specifically to industry decarbonization in developing countries. We're there to unlock the finance, the technical support, and the opportunities the developing countries need to meaningfully participate in the green transition. Why are we so focused on developing countries? Well, we believe at SIF that they hold the key to the energy transition, because soon they will be on set to run on 70% of the world's energy supply, represent 97% of the world's population growth, and 60% of the world's GDP. The same trend is true for heavy industry. So the IEA predicts that carbon emissions from heavy industry need to decline by 20% by 2030, 93% by 2050 to achieve net zero. That trend is all the more pressing in developing countries because that is where production is set to increase, which means that the carbon intensity needs to decline even faster. And what CIF is seeking to address is providing that finance, that access to finance at concessional rates, to provide the below market rate to those countries so that they are able to access those opportunities. How do we seek to do so? So as you can see, iron and steel is front and foremost among those target investment areas, but the industry decarbonisation programme would cover a broad range. I'm not going to rattle through them all. You know them all well, but you also know that these are cross-sectoral and that advancements in one of these areas means advancements in many. And the momentum that we are seeing across the industry at the moment is what's powering behind this programme. However, we don't come to you as experts in the steel industry or even in industry decarbonisation as a whole. It has been illuminating to listen to my fellow panelists earlier today, and I look forward to hearing more now, as well as all of your questions. We're here to learn about what the financing challenges are that you see as the sectoral experts, to be guided by your expertise and the opportunities that you see, so that we can better design a programme that can meet those challenges, that can leverage those opportunities, and better access that finance to the firms who need it the most around the world. As Edwin said earlier this morning, we want to see those areas of common participation in the short term, not just what those breakthrough technologies need to be in 10 or 15 years, but what we can start doing next year and where we can start doing it. Where are our finite resources best applied? And looking forward to hearing more from both panelists and you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, this was the warming up questions. Now we continue our conversation with the more specific questions for each panel. If you look at the composition of our panels today, we have CIF, and we have a development bank, and then a commercial bank. When I see the flow of money comes from CIF, gets fund from G8 government. It goes to CIF, and CIF serve MDBs, and MDBs serve countries and then government agencies. And then the commercial banks also get money from development bank. Is that correct?
We co-finance with development banks.
So I see the flow of money and different roles the finance institutions play for our transition. So let's get our questions answered from different corners of the finance today. This is a great opportunity for us. Let me start with the question. When we were looking at the expected cost of transition, we saw great variations from different papers to different studies. And the number we shared is our conclusion from that analysis. What do you think? Do you think it looks reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I was actually expecting a much more wider spread or range, but then I think it's quite a decent margin. And I trained as a mining engineer, and I remember part of my first internship, what one of my leaders told me is that if he had 5 geologists come to him with the same results, he will fire 4 and retain 1. So if all those numbers were the same, I would say that you might as well ditch all your research providers and stick with me. But thankfully, they're not. And the key thing there is that that signifies the stage of the industry we are in. In early stage, and this is where we are in terms of green technologies, we're in early stage. Most of these technologies are either in pilots, are either in labs, or are in demonstration phases. And at that point, it will be very difficult to actually put a hand or a finger on the required CapEx to scale this up. So it's a lot of estimates, it's a lot of guesswork, and also it's a lot of intelligent analysis there. So as we move into the 2030s, where these technologies transition from being pilots into much more mature everyday technologies, you're going to see most of these costs converge as well. But then I do think that in summary, it's a sign of the times that we're really in early stage. And as such, it would remain like that in terms of the spread. And ultimately in the 2030s, I would probably put a midpoint there that will be between 4.5.
Okay. Alfredo, as development bank, you mostly work with the government and the agencies. Do you have financing products offerings in place to directly support steelmakers? What do steelmakers need to do to get the fund from you?
Thank you for the question. We do mostly support governments through what we call our sovereign lending products, which are guaranteed by each government. But we also have private sector loans to commercial sector. As Gabriel mentioned, we co-finance, we go together in many deals where our private sector arm, similar to the IFC from the World Bank Group, our private sector operations department does finance private sector companies. And private steelmakers could actually benefit from those loans, even though they are commercial rates. Having said that, we also support state-owned enterprises. And in Asia, as you could imagine, in China and India, Indonesia, large steelmakers are usually state-owned, and they can benefit from our sovereign loans, which are significantly cheaper than commercial rates, and they have to be guaranteed by the government through the Ministry of Finance. And with all that, we can also support access to certain products, like, for example, green bonds. We help structure this type of products, working with companies, as well as SOEs. We can help them structure this type of products so they can go into capital markets and issue sustainability-linked bonds or green bonds if they're willing to finance, investments in their facilities that are justified, like, for example, the transition to green steel would be definitely qualified for this.
Thank you, Alfredo. Well, I want to ask another question, just to be sure. Do we have enough money in the pot?
Well, definitely ADB doesn't have $3.5 trillion to lend, but I'm sure that if we all get together, there is plenty of money going around the world, and it's just a matter of where you look at. If you look at certain sectors that suddenly become interesting for investors, suddenly there is a lot of interest and a lot of money flow in that direction. Maybe green steel can happen as a way of an investment opportunity for many. As Kwasi mentioned in his presentation, there is obviously the carrot and stick situation, but we are seeing, similar to the energy sector, that new regulations, new demand from consumers to buy green energy, that can happen with consumers trying to or choosing to buy green steel. And that is going to create that demand and that investment opportunity for many. So there is money from banks. There's money also from private investors that can go together hand in hand towards helping with this transition.
Thank you. I'm very happy to hear that there is enough money in the pot. My question for Gabriel. As we saw the result of our survey, many steelmakers consider commercial banks as their main source of funding. And what would be key deciding factors for your bank to provide low-cost capital to steelmakers? What are you looking
Before
at?
that, can I answer the previous question on is there any money in the pot? I agree with Alfredo, but the financial system as a whole, when looking at what central banks have been pulling in, there is plenty of money, and there is plenty of money looking for green projects and green programs, etc. That being said, not all transition projects are equal. Today, it's much more easier to finance a solar project or a wind project anywhere in the world than a greenfield green steel project. So even though there is a lot of money looking for opportunities, which is real, the fact that green steel or low carbon steel or whatever you call it is actually pushing the boundaries of new technologies and, more importantly, new business model means that it's only a portion of this financial markets or financial money that is available to these projects. So our responsibility, our collective responsibility, is to make sure that we de-risk all together, and there are few commercial banks that can help you with that, like pioneering this new business model, pioneering these new technologies, in making sure that we don't wait 20 years as we waited for the solar to become mainstream. We need to make green steel technologies mainstream as quickly as possible in order to have access to the full-fledged of financial product that the financial world can provide. Otherwise, you know, you will have to go to specialized lenders or specialized entity, and as Alfredo said, there is not enough money in that specific pot. So before that, how can we make collectively again a project bankable? And for us, it's always about low cost. It's not marketing. It's just that if we realize that we have to lend at 10%, we wouldn't do the deal because it's not for us. It's for someone else. So what we're trying to do when looking at green steel or green ammonia or green hydrogen or whatever is first looking at the business model, and that's the most strategic and challenging things that we are experiencing today altogether, is that the business model is not there. It was said this morning by, I think, Emirates Steels and others. Just because there is a green premium to the project that the off-takers or the buyers are not really able to pay right now. So this is the main challenge. And this is not a financial problem, and we were discussing that at lunch. We should not mix economical problems with financing problems. So a lot of people are coming to us saying, well, we can't finance our projects. We have a financing problem. When you look at it, no, it's not a financing problem. Your product is not competitive. It has no market. So then what you need is not a financing. You need a grant. You need someone that is giving you free money, which is part of the financing, but it's not the financing. So first, we need to collectively solve the economical issue. It could be carbon tax. It could be many things. We're agnostic. We just want to have something that is getting closer to an economical viability. And then we can discuss about the financing. And what makes a financing then viable is just visibility. Visibility on the technology, who is doing what. It doesn't mean that everything has to be fully secured and de-risked. It's just visibility. We're not engineers. We're not in your position. So we just need you to explain to us. We need you to explain to our consultants. And collectively, we're building something. That's something that we're doing as we speak. There have been some very interesting financing from the private sector in green steel, and some of them in the Nordics, which are very famous. And that's exactly what has been done. It was about, you know, collectively write something that has an economical viability and where we had visibility over the long term in order for us to provide some, as you quoted, low-cost capital. So did it answer the question?
Okay. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Kwasi, you have some to comment on?
Just a quick one in addition to that is I think more importantly what the industry also needs in terms of financing is what I call a diversified capital market. And I like the solar example you use. If you take the tech example, if a tech entrepreneur had a brilliant idea, they don't first walk to Wall Street. They'll go to Silicon Valley. And then after they are able to test the product, they go to Wall Street to IPO or to raise some base scale money. And it's important that as an industrial industry, we need to adopt that model where we understand that we should classify what is patient capital. Patient capital is a capital that is ready to bank on 100 companies, knowing that only one or none will succeed. In the steel industry or in the metal industry as a whole, if a metal company give an early stage ecosystem money to look for the next wave, if you give them 10 million, they expect 10 ideas. But it doesn't happen like that in the innovation world. So I think diversified capital market is important. How many of the companies here have a CVC, a corporate venture capital fund? None. Right? But then without an internal CVC to take that risky capital into risky projects that would help de-risk these projects for commercial banks to find attractive, it's probably going to be hard. So I just wanted to add on top of it that beyond just commercial bank, it's important that other avenues of financing become available to the industry, and it can start from the industry itself through its CVCs. and CVC Corporate Venture Capital Fund.
Thank you, Kosh. Wow, a lot of information to digest. Okay, let me go to Sif, Elizabeth. One of the questions Andy had in mind was, where can Sif have most impact in supporting the decarbonization of the steel sector?
So I'm very glad that all of my panelists have touched on exactly the kind of words I was going to use: low-cost capital, patient capital, the other avenues of finance. This is, I think, the heart of the SIF business model, in that the idea, SIF was founded with the idea that it would tackle the hardest challenges in climate finance by providing that capital to those projects. And how does that work? A government will go and identify what those projects will be. It sets them out and it identifies, so in this particular case, it would identify industrial decarbonization programs in an investment plan. It would submit that plan to be endorsed and reviewed. Funding comes from SIF, and then those programs are implemented with the help of MDBs in country. And it's government-led. It's using flexible, patient, concessional capital. That's below market rate funding to be able to de-risk those projects. And we have a whole range of tools at the disposal, blended finance tools, some of which may be very familiar to some of you, insurance, guarantees, hedging, all the sorts of tools that allow us to crowd in private investor financing, because this project would otherwise be deemed too risky. So where does SIF see our greatest impact? It's at getting those first-of-their-kind projects to market. It's bringing those technologies that are maybe proven but not yet market-ready, or building a track record in that market, or allowing those investors the ability to access those projects because we have raised their credit rating, or just de-risk the project as a whole. It of course does not mean that there is enough money in just the SIF pot, and I think I have to agree that there is enough money out there, and in many cases we have the technology. It is about how we structure those that financing in order to be able to channel it to where it is most needed. And I think that's the challenge that we keep coming up against, is that there's a lot of well-intentioned investors out there, there's a lot of technology out there, there's a lot of projects that are ready to go, but they're not necessarily meeting each other. That's where we seek to have the most impact, is in bringing those two together, getting that to market, and then someone else can go down the runway that we've been building.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It goes back to the discussion we had earlier in the previous session, that we heard that there is having a single definition, having a single policy, having a single price, carbon pricing is challenging, and in reality it is not really working for the steel industry at the moment. So when we don't have one single definition for green steel, how do you separate real green project, real green product, and then the other part to finance the real green project? So what's your take on this? Do you think the steel industry should have one definition and policy, aligned policy for the industry?
Well, let me take a first try on this very touchy question I understood this morning. So for us, as a bank, what would apply is the European taxonomy that would help us to define whether the loan is eligible to be green or not. And well, you may be familiar with the European taxonomy, that I won't discuss that. But that does not solve, actually, the real value of green steel, which is the green premium. And I will exit the steel world and just share with you what I can see taking care of the hydrogen sector and what is happening in hydrogen globally in Europe. Low carbon hydrogen or green hydrogen or whatever you call it, you have even more definition than just for steel. And even in Europe, depending on where your hydrogen molecule is ending, you will have plenty of regulation. A refiner would not have the same regulation as a steel maker, as a chemical producer, or for transportation. And even within transportation, you would have different regulation for maritime, for aviation, etc. The resulting of this different regulation, which is actually the real market for these molecules, implies that the willingness to pay for the green premium is very different from one industry to another. Same molecule, same geographical area, various regulation, various price. And I'm not saying that this is the good answer, but at the end of the day, it's a very flexible market for a hydrogen producer, because the greenest of the green, which is RFNBO, would go into one industry, and then the low carbon would go in another industry, and at various price. I'm not sure whether it's a good solution or not, but at the end, it creates multiple market for multiple type of productions, and it seems to be better than a very extreme definition that would actually make half of this potential market, not eligible to be green or not. So I would be tempted to follow what has been said this morning, is let the market decide. We can apply regulation on the various end market, but let the market decide exactly what they need and what they want.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you have any comment?
Again, on a very touchy subject, I think it's also about the resources that we have at our disposal. So we are outspoken about being very technology agnostic at this point in time, because it's still a moving landscape. And so whilst there are people in the room who have said that it's green hydrogen and green hydrogen only, that doesn't necessarily encompass all the different options that are open, certainly for steel, but also for many of the other sectors who are still playing with a range of different technologies and business models, not least of all those that really explore energy efficiency and materials efficiency as a broader set. And what's so important about those is that because they are energy agnostic, in the long run, even if we ran on green hydrogen, we would still be using less energy. And it's so hard for us to be able to understand right now what those might be, that it would feel very dangerous for us to come down on what is or is not a green steel or green concrete or zero emissions shipping in this situation. We want to provide financing without having that kind of set guideline, whether or not there's we can all agree that the end goal is of course a net zero industry, and by doing so, it's about allowing us to level that playing field, especially because when we're talking about this in developing countries, we're looking at such a different range of challenges in those areas. And in many of those countries, and I think we heard earlier today, that it will cost so much more money to fund the currently running plants than it will to build new ones. So green hydrogen is on the way, but what are we going to do with most of our industrial fleet, most of which has 30 years before the end of its life? We need to be looking at retrofitting, which means other business models, and how do we encompass those?
Kwasi, Alfredo, do you have any comment on this single definition requirement?
I actually agree with Gabriel and Elizabeth said. It would be dangerous to come up with one black or white definition now. It will keep many people or many products and many factories out of business just because they are not considered green enough. Obviously, there is always the risk of having certain greenwashing going around, but I think that it's interesting to let the market choose, even though sometimes it sounds a bit dangerous because markets, it seems, they are not that efficient, as we're being told. They're still relatively efficient in allocation of capital when the demand is there. And if grade 2 green steel makes sense for certain industries, whereas in another industry it has to be a grade 1 or green 1 type, then let it be. The price will adjust in that regard depending on supply and demand. So I think taxonomies are good and should be there for certain reasons, but we should not be too stringent with certain definitions, particularly at this stage where there is no technology that we know is going to work for sure, and there were certain things that we still don't know, and even in 10 or even 15 years, we will have no idea. So let's start moving and take the first steps rather than thinking too far ahead of ourselves.
Okay, I think this comment is a bit relieving for us. The pressure is a bit less on one definition. Before I open,
my colleague from ING was not disagreed with me, so we have one all, you know. So well, you need a third commercial banks too, you know. He's not here anymore, so.
Oh, he's not there anymore?
Good, so he left.
Okay.
He lost.
Maybe it's time to open questions to the floors. So if anybody has questions to or join the conversation with us. Okay.
Yeah, hello. I'm Valentin Vogel, steel industry analyst at ARIA. And so we spoke a lot about what can be financed. And I'd be curious to hear what maybe cannot be financed anymore or soon. And maybe picking up on an example from earlier, let's say we confirm this strong suspicion that coal mine methane is actually a big problem and we get good data on that. What trends do you see of certain activities? It doesn't have to be technologies, but highly emitting activities in the steel space that might struggle with access to finance, could also be insurance. I'd be really curious to hear your take.
Who would like to take this question?
Who? Okay. So, as a commercial bank and as many others, so we've signed principles and we're member to NZBS or Net Zero Banking Association, which forces to publish some trajectories on what we call our financed emissions. We started with our 5 most emittive sectors end of last year. Steel was not part of those top 5, which is good news, but you're in the next 5, which we are going to publish by the end of this year. It means, so it's trajectories. I can't share with you whether it's in absolute or relative numbers, because I don't know yet. But the idea is that we will use, a starting point, and we will apply to ourselves, emission reduction, which we hope will be compatible with what you're working on. So to answer your question, what cannot be financed, or there are some no-go zone for us as a commercial bank. For instance, coal mining, we exited in 2014, and we won't resume that. But then it will be more a matter of managing our trajectory, and hopefully we can help you again for all of you to meet that trajectory. But if it is not the case, then there might be, and that's the negative aspect of setting yourself some trajectory on things that you can't control, some arbitrage between clients, and reallocating, our steel balance sheet to less emittive clients compared to most emittive clients. So I don't see, for the time being, a kind of red list of things that we can't finance, and we have that, for certain industries. But for steel, we don't see that happening yet. But it will be a matter of your overall emissions and how they fit within our own trajectory.
If I add on another question onto that question, earlier you mentioned that the focus should be on the progress of how much CO2 avoided, instead of the actual intensity. So let's give some examples. There are 2 companies with a very low level of CO2 emissions intensity, and they want to borrow money. And there's another company with a higher level of CO2 emissions intensity, but their reduction progress has been quite significant in the last couple of years, and their projected reduction is looking good. But you have a limited fund. If you have to choose one of the 2 companies, which one would you choose?
No one is recording anything. I don't want that video to pop up in 2 years' time. Listen, I think we are a client-oriented bank. And that's us. I don't speak for the others. So meaning that if we have banking relationship with you and you're showing progress and your progress again is aligned with our trajectory, there is no reason why we would, end up that relationship. So again, it's a matter of whether, overall, because we won't look at companies by company, we will look at our overall portfolio. That's the way we're gonna work. That's what we're doing on power, on oil and gas, etc. It's at the portfolio level, and then if we have to arbitrate, then we'll have to take decision, but it will be at the relationship level. So yes, of course, once you've set up these trajectories, and again, that's what people are asking us to do, but the negative impact is that we will always benchmark any addition to our steel balance sheet against the trajectory. So you're right that if we are adding more emission intensity, and if we cannot compensate with, I don't know, someone that is doing much better, on the other side, maybe we'll have to refuse. It is a potential consequence.
Kwasi?
Yeah, I think context really matters, and so for us, we do look at investment trends as well. And I'm going to give you another scenario where you've got one company that has allocated or has spent, let's say, $1 billion in the renewable energy industry the previous year, and you've got another company that has spent $100 million on the renewable energy industry. And if we were to give, once again, an applause for these two companies, obviously go to the 1 trillion company. But then if I added on top of it that, oh, by the way, the 1 trillion company, or the 1 billion company, was an oil company, and it only represented 0.1 of its investment in new build technologies. How would you feel about that? But then the 100 million company pretty much spent all its capex on renewable energy technology. What would be your reaction? So I think context very matters a lot. And let me put this in practice. Look at the way the market rewards traditional auto companies like the Volkswagen, the BMW, and all that, right? Tesla's production is a fraction of what the majors produce. But then how has the market rewarded them on the share market? It's by far has the biggest market cap, although its production, it's a tiny fraction of what the majors produce. So I think context really matters. Yes, you're doing electric, but if only 1% of your fleet is electric, the market sees it. The market sees the bigger impact. So yes, intensity matters. Yes, absolute numbers matter. But then putting that within context really helps banks like yourself and overall the market appreciate who is on their future trajectory and who is likely to remain in the past.
Thank you. I saw a few hands up for questions. Okay.
Yeah, so my query is to all four of you. So how green is green steel? I couldn't get from the discussions. In the sense, Elizabeth showed one slide where she said steel industry move to EAF with scrap. But a country like India, where EAF requires a lot of power, it's a huge power-intensive industry, say 60 to 70% is fossil fuel. So then where do we draw the line for green steel?
Yes, I think the big consensus we've realized today is that there's no single magic bullet. But then for me, I think broadly speaking, if we're talking about green steel, it really comes down to managing the emissions. What we all know in this room is the fact that the steel industry or every plant that produces steel at the moment emits XYZ tons of CO2 on a per ton basis. If we can bring down, I think zero is hypothetical, but then if we can bring down to significantly lower level, I think that is where I would draw the line. So really technologies that push the boundaries on reducing the associated emissions of producing steel. And I think if we can get that, for us, whether it's to 1 kilogram, 1 gram, 2 grams, 3 grams, I mean, ultimately, we're going to come to that. But if you look at the whole ecosystem, the power that is being produced, someone talk about the coking coal that is being used and all that, it's important that all these things should contribute to lowering the overall carbon footprint of steel production. That is where I'll draw the line.
And Hiro, you have questions?
Thank you very much for the very interesting, stimulative discussions. And I understand that there is a massive flow of money going to renewables, as Gabriel mentioned. But that is because the renewable industries are being supported by long-term cash flow supporting mechanisms, such as the long-term PPAs or the feed-in tariff or whatever. That is what we are lacking in the current stage. So and additionally, the renewables, the life of the projects are much shorter than the iron and steel industry, because once we invest in the iron and steel production, that capacity need to run 20, 30 years to recover the initial cost. So do you think that do we need some kind of a long-term cash flow guarantee mechanism from the market? And if that is the case, who is going to be responsible to secure that system? Either government or customer or whoever? That's my question.
So I can start. Yeah. So the energy industry, obviously, it's a very different dynamic in the sense that pretty much almost every country, the government, in most cases, is a sole consumer of power, right? And in most instances, like the previous slide I talked about, government is always the first mover. I want to go green 2050, so it's able to organize an auction, get in a feed-in tariff, and then you guaranteed your revenue for the life of the project. Whereas if you look at the steel industry, the consumers are very bilateral. Like each steel manufacturer would have about 20, 30 systems. So the model that worked for energy is not entirely what's going to work for the steel industry, given that change in dynamics, right? So I would say that whereas with renewable energy, it was more policy-led in order to bring costs down, with steel, it will be more technology-led, right? And there's another example, if it permits me to add, is you look at what happened in the auto sector, right, where government had to guarantee a certain level of costs. And I think increasingly we're going to see that happen in steel when overnight Brussels or whatever government is realize that 7% of emissions, you cannot just wish that away. You cannot just use tech to move companies to do the right thing. Government needs a skin in the game. And whatever, like is it a purchase subsidy like we see in the IRA being offered, or is it a manufacturing subsidy like China did with this auto companies 10, 15 years ago? So I would say that it will be more technology-led. Interventions by government will be more technology-led. But then the key thing is that it's important for the industry to embrace these. And I was talking to a steel C-suite a few months ago about how the industry is awash with all these green money. And he confidently told me that, look, I would never take government money. I don't want a seat on my board. I don't want to understand. But then this is the times we are in where you talked about the whole industrial system is going to be disrupted one way or the other, whether we agree or disagree. We need to change the way we produce some of these products like steel. So it's important that companies embrace this change. And I think with that, it becomes easier for this money to find. I know it's easier said than done, but then the industry itself must acknowledge that we want to work towards this, and then dialogue with government, dialogue with policymakers as to these are the technologies we think would help us reach there. This is the cost. This is where government should meet us at the point of our needs. And I think we saw that happen in the auto sector. And it's very possible it will happen in the steel industry as well.
I would like to add something on Kwasi's comment. It's not comparable, the renewable energy industry to steel, but there is certain similarity when we are talking about the risk of stranded assets of coal power plants to coal furnace in steel industry. Because when somebody's investing and building now polluting technology, high CO2 emitting technology, they have to stay with that plant for 25 or 30 years. It seems that there is a very strong movement towards decarbonization across the board on every industry, including steel. The question is, like the game of the chairs, who's going to be sitting on those assets that are going to be stranded at the end? So perhaps it's good to start thinking how to deal with this current situation and not be the one sitting in the last chair, but rather having kind of a first-moving approach and try to find ways, as Kwasi mentioned, it's going to be technology-led, but trying to find those technologies, trying to find ways of reducing cost, but also, and likely, eventually they will get reflected on the price. Nobody expects that steel in 2050 is going to be cheaper than currently. because eventually things are going to be, they have to be reflected on price, the current situation and the current additional cost. If prices go down, it's because, like with solar and with wind, there was massive investments triggered maybe by government subsidies. Probably they have to be there to kickstart the industry change. But that kind of mindset is needed. And it's dangerous at this stage, I think, to not think on the risk of stranded assets like coal-fired power plants are suffering now.
And maybe to complete, it took us 20 years and a lot of money to scale up the solar panel manufacturing capacity, the wind turbines, etc., and lower the cost. This is what happened. Now solar is competitive in many countries, wind is getting more and more competitive, so you see these feed-in tariffs, etc., disappearing in many countries, actually. This is a feeling, and maybe I'm wrong, that we will need less money to be spent on new technologies for steel to scale them down. So maybe and hopefully we don't need 20 years and we don't need multi-billions of money to scale up these technologies and make them as competitive as possible. Because a strong, actually, a significant portion of your problem is an energy problem. And energy is being taken care of. It's a global problem. It's not only you. And the 5,000 billions that you were mentioning, actually, 2/3 or even more than that were linked to the energy systems, energy generation. And this energy cost has to go down, and thanks to renewables. So hopefully, just looking at just the steel, the money that needs to be spent on steel plants to scale up the technologies, hopefully is nothing to do with the amount of money that has been spent in renewable. But again, maybe I'm wrong. It's a feeling.
Yeah, I actually agree. 1/3 of the problem is energy, and that is off your balance sheet as a business. So.
Okay, over there. You are the next one.
Hi, my name is Karan. I'm from the International Renewable Energy Agency. So one of my key takeaways from this session is that there are some initiatives in providing that patient, low-cost capital for green steel or low-carbon steel in developing and emerging economies. It's to you. So this moves the needle in addressing those financial challenges. But what are some of the economic barriers? Like, is there demand to make these projects bankable, and what are the potential solutions to these issues that these things cause? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we were talking earlier today at lunch about exactly this issue. There are some financing challenges, but there are also some wider economic challenges. And in discussions with a colleague recently, we were talking about how to scale up green bonds and how they're an important channel of finance for certain areas of the world, but why are developing countries not being able to access it? And he said it's all very well and good being able to teaching someone how to develop a green bond, but if you can't issue a bond in that country, we're not going to move the needle anyway. And I think that's it's a sort of wider, broader set of problems. What we do invest in, as well as projects, as well as technologies, we also invest in policies. We also invest in the kind of technical support to build the enabling environment that is needed in these contexts. It's hard to describe exactly what that would consist of for industrial decarbonisation. I would be happy to hear from those of you in the room who could pinpoint what those economic challenges might be in any individual country, but my gut would be that they go well beyond industrial decarbonisation and perhaps well beyond the catalytic capital that we can provide. Some of the things that we have tried to do in the past are about long-term government signals. We need to know that there is a government in power who is going to continue following the path that they have set out, verbally in terms of policy, that they are making legislation in that direction, and that makes it much easier to crowd in private investment and much easier to bring in the MDBs. And I mean, we could go on, but the broad range of issues there is really quite wide. yeah, let me pass.
Yeah. And I was just going to add one thing. So, I mean, we as a business, we've been following the energy and the transport evolution to clean technologies over the last 20 years. And we only started looking at hardware-based sets as 5 years. And these are the three things that we saw happen in the energy and then the transport industry. So the number one mover is policy, right? And policy is carrot and stick. Yes, you set targets, but then also you provide subsidies or whatever support, financial support, right? And so that will be the first mover. So that can get you up to 10% of market demand or market production. The next wave is where we see the economy of scale bring down costs. And then you reach cost parity. And we saw that in solar, we saw that in wind, where the initial off-takers were government, and then ultimately, once that moved into cost parity with other existing technologies, the adoption became mass scale. But then to reach that cost parity, you need to have domestic demand. And that is where, or the first two, is where most emerging markets lack, right? So yes, you can have the political will. An emerging economy, you can have the political will to say, look, I will ban internal combustion engine, or I'll ban a BOF plant. But then in the end, do you have the corresponding subsidy to ensure that these factories do not shut down and people lose their jobs? No. And then the second part is the economy of scale. It is actually the biggest driver of cost reduction in every industrial business. And that is why if you look at the China model, or even to a larger extent, the European model, the first thing they actually do, if they want to move into any market, they use the economy of scale as an example, right? And that is where most emerging markets fail, in the sense that how much steel is produced in Africa, as an example, right? So it would not really, the first two, policy that incentivizes new technologies. At the moment, most of the emerging economies would not have the carrot to incentivize that. The economy of scale that drive costs down to make it competitive with traditional technologies, they don't have the economy of scale because they don't produce, they don't consume. So the third wave is where they will catch it. It's where someone has used this policy like the IRA to bring global costs down, or like China did with solar to bring costs down. They use the economy of scale to even bring it down further. And then they reach the third wave where there are multiple options. The IP is all over the world. So I think the third wave is where most emerging countries will benefit. But then the first two, it would be in other areas playing in those spaces. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay, thank you, Kwasi. I think we are coming to the end of our session, but I saw one hand over there. It has to be the last question.
Thank you. So again, I'm Fadil Mohammed from Emirati Arkan. Gabriel gave us a nice comment saying that economics and finance are completely two different things. But the way how it's, which I agree 100%, but now in the current state where we are right now, I think they both come hand in hand, because if the economics is not going correct, then the finance will not be there. And also I've been hearing comments that are saying that we should wait for the market to decide how green steel will be and what green steel will be, and maybe some governmental interferences will actually help aid in that. But the way I see it is that if we wait for the market or the clients or customers to decide that, and as well as governments to decide that, that will not actually help us create premiums for us to benefit from these finances or to get our payback from the finances. Actually, it will put us in a, let's say, a prerequisite for customers to ask for a specific intensity, let's say, for the same exact price. And this is what many companies are facing. So we go and we lobby, and then they ask for a specific intensity where we paid money to achieve that intensity, and then they will take it at the same price. So now the question is, how can these economics, or how can we influence these economics to actually help in us going for financial options? And how can these financial options, for example, be helpful for us to make the economics run properly?
So when looking at how financing can interfere or help the economics, there are two things. First is cost of capital, which actually, when you look at actual figures, is fairly minimal in the price of, per ton of steel, of green steel. But the most important is probably the tenor of the loan that we can, and the amortization stress that we put on you to repay the loan, and that starts to have a massive impact. So having a 5-year loan or a 25 years loan makes a big difference in terms of you getting sufficient money to repay either your loan in 5 years or in 25 years. So you're absolutely right that they go hand in hand, because if you want me to provide you a 25 years loan, I will want a 25 years visibility on both volumes and price. I have helped you a little bit on prices, but then you have to help me back on volumes, visibility, and then on price. And this is where actually it's getting the most challenging part of any green material that we are trying to finance is, what is the price? Is it a grey price plus a premium? Is it a different, demand and supply balance? And this, again, if I can re-quote myself on what I said about the definition of green steel. What I said is that we should let the regulation apply on each buyers. So it doesn't mean that the market should decide. The market should decide between each category of buyers, but there has to be a regulation on the buyers, either a mandate, or a constraints, a premium, a subsidies, or whatever, but something has to happen on the buyers. Otherwise, I agree, nothing will happen. So when you combine everything, so you have visibility on volumes, visibility on price, and of course we can fine-tune the financings to get you a better price position, but it will be marginal again. So we can do a lot of things, but at the end of the day, you're absolutely right that the off-taker will make the difference and not us, even though we're here to help.
Okay, with that, I think we need to close the session. I thank you all the panelists for sharing your insight and your ideas, and also for the audience for listening to our conversation. Maybe this conversation can continue during the break, so if you want to grab one of our panelists, go for it, and maybe we continue our conversation in the next coming years. Okay, thank you all.
With pleasure.